Hello, everyone, and welcome to Impostor Syndrome. Why do I feel like a fraud even at the top? In this 45-minute program, you're going to learn what imposter syndrome is, why it haunts you even when you're at the top of your field and extremely successful, and how to combat it with specific techniques and strategies. I want to thank you for taking these 45 minutes to learn about imposter syndrome and spend this time with me. And I'd like to encourage you to turn off all distractions, really turn off ringers and close your door and make this 45 minutes about you. Now, there is a workbook for this webinar, and we're going to link to it in the comments so that you can actually use this workbook, print it out, and handwrite as you go. Handwriting, as I'll explain later, is extremely powerful. I'm Susan Baroncini-Moe, and I'll be leading the webinar today, as well as others in this series. I'm an executive coach with over 16 years experience working primarily with successful women who are executives, entrepreneurs, small business owners, and other high performers. I have a master's degree in social psychology, and I have spent, and I continue to spend, a significant amount of my time in training to keep my skill set fresh and current. I'm the author of the book Business in Blue Jeans: How to Have a Successful Business on Your Own Terms in Your Own Style. You can find the trailer on YouTube, and you can find the book at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and many other fine booksellers. I've worked with clients on 4 continents in a wide range of industries, and just a few fun facts about me. I held the Guinness World Records title for the world's longest uninterrupted live webcast for 2.5 years, and that was both audio and video. I've tried over 100 hobbies in my lifetime. I've played violin for 38 years, and I've read over 2,500 books on the subjects of personal development and personal growth, business, leadership, entrepreneurship, psychology and psychiatry, coaching, wellness, networking, relationships, interpersonal dynamics, philosophy, management, really anything you can think of to make your life better. Now, all of that might sound kind of impressive, I suppose. And if you had given me that list several years ago, I'm going to tell you, in the interest of transparency, I would probably have been shaking my head, feeling that very familiar, uncomfortable feeling inside, hearing my inner critic say, yeah, but if they only knew the truth about me. Yes, that's right. I suffered from something called imposter syndrome. I felt like a fraud. I was always worried about being found out somehow. So despite all of my achievements, despite being a successful person by most measures, I was always concerned that someone would discover the quote-unquote truth about me, that I was just a big phony. So I suffered from imposter syndrome, and I'm not alone. You probably feel it too, or you wouldn't be here. But more than that, women from Sotomayor and Maya Angelou to Oprah and Sheryl Sandberg, Tina Fey, Kate Winslet, even men suffer from it. Don Cheadle has come forward and admitted that all these people have said, yes, I often feel like a fraud. I always feel like I don't belong. And I feel like I'm going to be found out at some point. People are going to realize they never should have given me all this responsibility. They never should have trusted me. So it's very common. It's very common in highly successful and accomplished people. And we're going to talk about it today. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to talk about what imposter syndrome actually is, where it comes from, and really how to conquer it. My goal for you today is for you to understand yourself a bit better. Or if you don't personally suffer from imposter syndrome, my goal for you is to better understand those who do and to gain some understanding about where it comes from. This can help you as a leader. This can help you to manage your team more effectively. And in general, I think this is really going to help you to understand people who work for you and work with you better. I also want you to come away from today with some strategies for managing imposter syndrome more effectively than perhaps you are now. So we're going to do a little bit of deep diving into your imposter syndrome. I hope you've downloaded the workbook and printed it out, because we are going to do some exercises that are going to help you dive deep. And we're going to take a little time as we go along to actually do the work. So if you haven't downloaded the workbook yet, make sure you go to the comments and make sure you get the link. Okay, let's start with a quick history of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome was first identified in 1978 by two clinical psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they explained that imposter syndrome is when a person believes they don't deserve the success, the honors, or the accolades that they've achieved. So they think of themselves as a fraud. They tend to dismiss all of their successes simply as the result of good timing, being lucky, and we're going to talk about luck in a couple of weeks. And there's another webinar in this series that we'll be covering that in. So being lucky, or that they've been able to fool people into thinking they're smarter or better at what they do than they actually are. So in essence, it's a disconnect between reality and perception. Now, one of the things I find most interesting about imposter syndrome is that it tends to be quite rampant in high-performing people. So the most successful people tend to think of themselves as imposters. Now, you may not believe it, but you're going to see later how that's true. So some studies have found that about 70% of all people feel like imposters at some point. We're not talking about like now and then or once in a while or those occasions when you walk into a room and realize you haven't prepared enough. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a more pervasive, recurring phenomenon that really does tend to happen more frequently to high-performing individuals. Some research indicates that at least 2 out of 5 successful people suffer from imposter syndrome, but I would actually estimate the number is quite a bit higher, but you'll see later why we don't really have accurate numbers when it comes to imposter syndrome. It's quite difficult to study this and gain true knowledge about it. So how do you know if you have imposter syndrome? What is it in more specific terms? So if you suffer from imposter syndrome, you tend to experience on a regular basis a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist even in the face of information that indicates the opposite is true. So you experience chronic self-doubt and feelings of intellectual fraudulence, and you feel that way even when there's clear evidence that you're wrong about your actual inadequacy. So the hallmark of imposter syndrome is actually a clear disconnect between perceived and real performance. You tend to have a lot of evidence that you're intelligent and quite good at what you do. You probably got good grades in school, you've been steadily promoted in your career, you have strong performance reports, you might have a string of letters after your name. You might have a list of awards and accomplishments and accolades a mile long. But because you're unable to internalize your successes, you still feel like you've been skating on thin ice or that you've been faking it. And any minute now, you're going to be found out, unmasked, and everyone will know you fooled them all. So that's the hallmark of imposter syndrome, is that disconnect between you're actually good at what you do, but you just don't internalize that feeling. So you also tend to discount your successes. You tend to attribute success to being fortunate or lucky or having good timing or your ability to deceive people. Also of note, people who have imposter syndrome actually desperately want praise for their accomplishments, but when they get it, they feel intensely uncomfortable and anxious because they're thinking, I don't deserve this. I'm just faking it, unlike all these other people around me who actually know what they're doing. So you tend to dismiss your successes. Now, both men and women tend to suffer from imposter syndrome, but men actually seem to try to avoid situations where they experience feelings of inadequacy, whereas women tend to work harder and try to be more competitive in those environments. So it can seem like, first of all, men don't like to admit that they have imposter syndrome. Women are more open about it. Second, men tend to avoid situations where they're going to experience it, and women tend to dig in and fight for it. So it's quite possible that we see imposter syndrome more in women for those two reasons. Now, other characteristics of people with imposter syndrome include you work really hard. Very gifted people tend to work hard. They tend to work harder than most people. And they do that in order to prevent people from discovering that they're imposters or that they think they're imposters. Unfortunately, that hard work leads to additional praise and success, both of which perpetuate the feelings of being an imposter and the fear of being discovered, right? So you work harder and you work much harder than other people, And then you get more praise for that and you feel even worse about it. People with imposter syndrome may feel like they need to work 2 or 3 times harder than other people. And in fact, you're probably a perfectionist. You over-prepare, you tweak details, you obsess, you check and recheck your work looking for mistakes, you second-guess yourself, and you tend to keep working on something until it's perfect. So mistakes tend not to be tolerated. We're probably going to add a webinar in this series on perfectionism, so keep your eyes out for that, because as I prepared for this webinar, I realized perfectionism is a problem in and of itself. So keep your eyes out for that. Another characteristic is you feel phony. People with imposter syndrome feel like they're a fraud. And another thing that people with imposter syndrome do quite frequently is they feel insecure about their ability to give the right answer. So even though they might know a lot, have a lot of knowledge, and have a lot of skills, they're concerned that people won't like them or they'll get things wrong. And so they tend to give answers that they think other people want to hear, which tends to lead to an increase of feeling like they're being fake. Because if you're giving the answer someone wants to hear rather than what the answer actually is, or searching deep to find the real answer, and all you're really doing is just really trying to say what people want to hear, you feel fake because you're being fake. So sometimes imposter syndrome is a little bit self-perpetuating because it leads to behaviors that are inauthentic. And so that encourages you to think, oh, I must not be an honest person. I'm deceiving people, because you engage in behaviors where you actually are. And that's something that isn't addressed frequently in the imposter syndrome literature, that there are characteristics, there are things that happen in imposter syndrome that make it a self-perpetuating phenomenon. And there are also things that, as you're going to see later, that actually happen in the world that make it an actual thing, a real thing. It's not all in your head. We're going to get to that. Another characteristic is you might have a massive ego on the outside. So one of the most interesting things to me about imposter syndrome is that it tends to get worse the further along in your career. So very successful people often have very bad cases of imposter syndrome, and that's true for a few reasons. So for example, imagine you've just gotten started in your career. If you're in your first year or you're an intern, if you mess something up, it's not a big deal. Someone's probably going to fix it for you, and they're not going to give you a lot of responsibility anyway, because you're just an intern or you're just a first year. So you don't really have a lot of responsibility. Now, flash forward to the point where you're the CEO. The buck stops with you, and you have a lot of responsibility, and nobody is going to fix it for you. So when you suffer from imposter syndrome, the more responsibility you're given, the more you feel like a fraud, even if you act like you have a huge ego and a ton of confidence on the outside. Now, another thing is, people who suffer from imposter syndrome are great at pretending to be confident, but they do feel differently on the inside. And this is another circumstance where imposter syndrome is self-perpetuating. So if you feel like you're pretending all the time, you're pretending to be confident, then you start to feel like a liar because you're pretending all the time. And that perpetuates feelings associated with imposter syndrome. And when you feel like you're pretending all the time, when you feel like you're lying, you continuously fear that you're going to be found out. Now, people with imposter syndrome also at times may avoid showing any confidence in their abilities at all. So you could do both. You could at times seem like you're hugely egotistical, and at other times you can avoid showing confidence in your abilities because you think, if I believe too much in my own importance, intelligence, and abilities, I may be rejected by others. And this is something that happens with women a lot, that if you are perceived to be too confident, then people won't like you. And we tend to worry about that quite a bit. So sometimes people with imposter syndrome may convince themselves they're not intelligent or they don't deserve success in order to avoid this feeling that people might not like them, or the fear of being rejected. And sometimes this shows up as being very quiet in meetings so they can avoid giving the quote unquote wrong answer. So you might have a massive ego on the outside at times, and you might also at times avoid displays of confidence depending on the situation or context. You might seek out relationships, and there's an asterisk here because we seek out relationships with others who are either supervisors or peers who can act as mentors or resources to help us continue to improve and expand our skills. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a wonderful strategy. But what's important about this strategy is what happens when women with imposter syndrome who have sought out relationships begin to receive praise or recognition. We tend to mentally award that success to the mentor or person who helped us. So it's not the seeking out of the relationship that's an issue. It's what happens when we get success because we've sought out that relationship or resource. We tend to attribute that success to the person who helped us. So things like, well, this is really George's success because he helped me with that presentation. So instead of saying, thank you, I'm the one who sought out that resource so that I could be better. And I was better as a result. We tend to think of ourselves as, oh, I'm just being a team member. We rationalize this thinking. And, it's only fair that I attribute some of this success to George because he did help me. And that's fine to do as long as it's not attributing all of the success. Because remember, you made an active choice to seek out assistance. And that's an active decision that you made that contributed to your success. So in addition to attributing some of your success to the guy who helped you or the woman who helped you, it's important to also remember you made the choice to go and get that help. Okay, in addition to attributing success to other people, you're also quick to attribute success to factors other than your competency. So just as relationships where you attribute success to your colleague or mentor, you also attribute success to your ability to fool people, to your personality, or to your ability to use charisma or charm. And that leads to us say, oh, I was really good at fooling that person. I was really good at deceiving them because I'm so charming. And instead of saying, I'm really good at what I do, and that's why they're impressed, we tend to attribute it to all these other things. Okay, we're going to take a minute and we're going to do some workbook time. Now, I really want to encourage you to do the exercises in the workbook now. Just thinking you're going to do it, oh, I'll do it later. We all do that, but don't do that because you probably won't. And if you just say, oh, I know this, and you just say, oh, I'll think about it, it won't have the same impact as actually doing the work, printing out the workbook and doing the work. There is something actually in the act of handwriting that impacts our brains differently from typing or just thinking about something. So it actually will impact you much more profoundly if you do this work. Since I know you have blocked off the time for this webinar, please just go for it. And right now in your workbook, take a minute or so. We're going to take a full minute. Ask yourself, do you have imposter syndrome? What are the symptoms that you show? Do you work really hard, like harder than most? Do you feel phony? Are you a perfectionist? And do you have a hard time delegating because you want everything to be perfect? We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks as well. Look for that webinar. Do you have a problem attributing your success to other people or other factors besides your own capabilities? And what symptoms do you show? So just take a quick minute, a full minute, really. It's quick either way. Take a minute and I'll take a sip of water and we'll come back in a minute and we'll continue. Okay, welcome back. I hope you did the work in your workbook and didn't just fast forward. Okay, let's talk about some of the consequences of imposter syndrome, because I think once you admit that you have a problem or something that you want to address or fix, one of the ways that it can become more powerful to actually motivate yourself to take action and do the things that it takes to make a difference is seeing the consequences and how this manifests in your life. So, some of the consequences of imposter syndrome include self-criticism, disengagement from corporate culture and organizational structure, choking under pressure, job dissatisfaction. And here's an interesting point. People with imposter syndrome tend to plan to stay at their job because they perceive that the social and psychological cost of leaving is too high. So think about that. Despite job satisfaction, these people are planning to stay at their jobs for a long time because it seems riskier to leave. So they're dissatisfied, they're disengaged, but they're going to stay longer. So that can quite easily lead to some of the other consequences like anxiety, depression, stress, low self-confidence, an overarching feeling of shame and self-doubt. So these are significant. They can really ultimately lead to significant problems. And we all know that anxiety, depression, some of these stress reactions, these kinds of things in your mental health can actually impact your physical health as well. So the consequences can be quite severe. So let's take another moment for a little bit of workbook time and ask yourself, how does imposter syndrome manifest itself in your life? What are some of the consequences that you've personally experienced with imposter syndrome? And I'm going to give you a minute to jot down some thoughts here and try to connect. Maybe you have anxiety or depression and you never connected it to imposter syndrome before. Maybe some of these things you never connected before. So I'm going to give you a minute to ponder that, and then we'll be back. Okay. So, where does imposter syndrome come from? Why do we have it? Now, I've hunted for the root cause of imposter syndrome for years, and there's very little information in the way of research on where it actually comes from. Now, some people thought it might be related to being a member of a non-dominant class, like being a woman or a minority, but this theory was kind of discounted because it doesn't explain why men who are white get imposter syndrome, and they do. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Some researchers have pointed to our culture of keeping up with the Joneses, conspicuous consumption, and the increased use of social media, in part, I think, because all three of these things are related to comparative behavior. So comparing ourselves to others. And we know when you look at social media and you're comparing your whole life, as they say, to somebody else's best parts of their lives. So we look at other people and assume that what they're sharing on Facebook is representative of their entire life, when in fact it's really just their best pieces. And so we tend to think, oh my gosh, my whole life, is a mixed bag, and their life is perfect. And so this tends to exacerbate imposter syndrome. Now, I don't think it's the cause, though. I just think these are things that make imposter syndrome worse. The problem is most research thus far doesn't seem to dive too deeply into the origins of imposter syndrome. So until they start to get into that a little deeper, we may not know for sure why in the aggregate people tend to get imposter syndrome. However, I'm going to share some of my hypotheses with you. I've been coaching women with imposter syndrome for the last 16 years, and I've been seeing it in all kinds of women, from women who are just starting out in their careers to women who are in the C-suite, from women who are just starting a business to women who have been in business for a long time and are very successful. I've seen imposter syndrome in women from all walks of life. But I have observed that imposter syndrome does tend to be most prevalent in people who are extremely intelligent and to whom things come fairly easily. When things come easy to you, when it's easy for you to do something, not necessarily that it's easy, meaning you still have to work at it and put time in, but you maybe don't have to fight against your own potential to accomplish your goals. When you don't have to work as hard as other people at things, it's harder to accept accolades. It's like saying, why are you so impressed with this? It hardly took me any time at all, right? It's like you work faster than other people. You're better at things than other people. What's the big deal? It was so easy. Well, things that are easy for you aren't necessarily easy for other people. But this is one of the reasons that it's hard for people with imposter syndrome to charge reasonable or high rates for their work. Because it's like, why would I charge a lot for something that comes so naturally or so easily to me? And people say, oh, but remember, you're charging for your time and energy that went into your training and education. But highly gifted people to whom things come fairly easily forget about their training and education because that came easily as well. Right? So again, we're not talking about not putting in time. Like, you might study a lot, but it's not like you're fighting against your potential or fighting against your intelligence. You're not butting up against the limits of what you can do. So for example, I've done big things in my life. I look at my life. My book was published. I signed a book deal. I broke a Guinness World Record and held it for a long time. I have a successful business by most measures. And I think most people would look at me and say, she's pretty successful. But, in terms of my accomplishments, I can say that. But I don't necessarily always feel like I have reached my full potential, meaning many of those things were time intensive and energy intensive, but I'm not sure I feel like I have really pushed the boundaries of what I'm capable of. And so I think that's a piece of imposter syndrome, is that we look at, what am I capable of? And it's quite common for clients to start coaching telling me that they don't feel comfortable negotiating, or that they struggle to negotiate a higher salary because they don't really think they deserve more because everything came so easy to them, or because they feel like they got lucky. And one way that luck can play into imposter syndrome is that if you were lucky enough to be born into a family of means, and if you had a lot of advantages, you're more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome because you're likely to attribute success to your privilege. This is one reason why some men might have imposter syndrome. It's possible they might see that family connections or private school education or those kinds of things helped them to get where they are. And they might look also at the women around them who are just as good as they are, but didn't get the promotions that they got or don't get paid as much. And there are some men, I know it's hard to believe, ladies, but there are some men who might rightfully think, I didn't really deserve this as much as she did, for example. Now, I don't know how much this happens. We have no data on this. And we don't have much data on men who have imposter syndrome because, as I mentioned before, they avoid situations where it may be activated, and they don't like admitting that they have it. Now, on the other hand, if you were born into a family without means, you may also feel imposter syndrome because you're afraid people will find out that you feel like you don't belong. And this theory kind of goes along with being a woman or a minority in what has long been considered a man's world. You can feel like an imposter solely based on the fact that as a woman, we aren't members of the boys' club. We're in many respects outsiders. And this holds true no matter how aggressive you are, no matter how much you think you can hang with the guys. So this is one of those components to imposter syndrome that may not be completely in your head. It may be related to the truth of the world around you. So this is one of those things. Imposter syndrome can be something that you've created. It can be related to your history. It can be related to a great many things that are in your head, but it can also be related to external structures that are in place. So imposter syndrome can come from many different places. And since there's not really that much research on the aggregate of the trends of why we have it, I tend to hunt down that information with each individual client, meaning that this feeling of not quite being at the same level as others around you, the feeling that you're just at the table because nobody noticed that you're faking it, it comes with indicators that give me a hint as your coach as to its cause for you. And then we can start to work on those things. So how do I find the indicators? Well, we start with, we all have a voice in our head. We have an inner critic. And so there's two kinds of there's kind of two versions of us in each situation present at any moment. There's the you that's in the situation right now, the actor, and then there's the you that's observing you in the situation right now. And the observer, that's the one that can turn into the inner critic. It's the one saying, you don't have the right to be here. They're going to find out that you don't know what you're talking about. And they say things like, what do you think is going to happen when they discover the truth about you? When I'm working with a client, one of the first things we do is to start to track down whose voices we're hearing in the inner critic, because the inner critic is usually the voice of someone or multiple someones in your past who said stuff like this to you. Now, sometimes a client will say, yeah, but it's my voice that I'm hearing. Well, that means we have to dig a little deeper, because here's the truth. None of us was born with an angry inner critic who's mean to us. You weren't born with a mean, angry inner critic. Rather, we acquire this, we develop it over time. People say things to us over time. Sometimes it's recurring patterns. Those can be transferred generationally. Sometimes some one person said something so mean and so hurtful that it can wound you so deeply that it echoes across time. You hear it over and over time. And what happens is, over long periods of time, you begin to integrate these voices so they become more and more your voice. So it sounds like your voice in your head, but it's not actually your voice. It's a voice that you assimilated, so it started to sound like you in your head. So I'm guessing as we've been talking about this, you've naturally been thinking, whose voice am I hearing? Whose voice am I hearing? And that's your next assignment in your workbook. Whose voice are you hearing as your inner critic? And who said things that made you struggle to own your accomplishments and successes? Where do those voices come from? And also ask yourself where you think your imposter syndrome does come from. Did you breeze through school? Do you feel like an outsider? Did someone say things to you frequently that stuck and that you assimilated? Did you come from privilege and you feel like you don't deserve any of the success you've had? Where does your imposter syndrome come from? And don't be frustrated if it's a bit challenging to find these answers. I work with many of my clients to dig into these answers all the time, and I would actually be quite surprised if you found them all in the span of this workshop. It can be difficult to know what to look for, to know what the signs are, and sometimes because you're in it, you can't clearly see the way an outside party can. But I would like for you to try to do this work now, because it will help you. So take a moment, ask yourself, whose voices am I hearing, and where might my imposter syndrome come from? Take some moment, think about it, and just do a little writing in your workbook. And we'll be right back. Let's get into some strategies for managing imposter syndrome and go beyond the inner critic, because I want to make sure that you leave today with some ideas for how to work on this thing. I'm going to tell you that getting rid of imposter syndrome is quite difficult. It's difficult because all change is difficult, especially something that's been a part of your brain for a long time. When you engage in a habit or old thinking, there's a part of your brain that lights up. So when you try to make a change, your brain will resist that change. Literally, new neurons will grow in place to keep that habit or old thinking staying there, keeping it in place. Imagine trying to do something with your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, imagine eating or writing with your left hand. If you're left-handed, imagine eating or writing with your right hand. Imagine how hard it would be as you try to learn to eat and write with your non-dominant hand. Imagine all the times you'd want to give up because it's just too hard. Forget it. But more importantly, I want you to imagine all the times when you would just forget and use your dominant hand. Making a change like that wouldn't be easy, and ridding yourself of imposter syndrome is just like that. It's something that's been in your brain for most of your life, and it really is not easy to change it. Now, one of the most common pieces of advice in imposter syndrome is to fake it until you make it. So in this strategy, they tell you to pretend that you're confident and you're not afraid. And in doing this over time, the idea is you'll feel it in reality. The problem with fake it until you make it is that it is extremely effective in cases where you're feeling blue. And I don't mean depression, but like you just woke up feeling blue, sad. Okay. So we know it's very effective to smile with your whole face when you feel a little blue because it activates endorphins in your brain and you actually start to feel better. So you can take this action, you feel better. But here's the thing about imposter syndrome. As you fake it until you make it, you're engaging in behavior that actually supports your beliefs about you being a fraud. You're faking it. That's fraudulent behavior. So you're actually reinforcing the notion that you actually are a fraud by engaging in fraudulent posturing. You're faking it. It's a lie. And so you're going to feel like it's a self-perpetuating thing. You fake it until you make it, but you never make it because you're faking it. So don't fake it until you make it. Okay, here's what does work. First of all, admitting that you suffer from imposter syndrome can be a very strong first step. As soon as you acknowledge it to yourself, and I'm saying admit it, not to the world, to yourself is fine. When you acknowledge it to yourself, then when it starts to poke at you, you can address it. So when you start to feel like a fraud or you have that anxiety about being found out, you can have a conversation with yourself and say to your inner critic, that is just imposter syndrome. It is not a real thing. I'm not actually going to get found out. There's nothing to find out. Look at all my successes. Now, speaking of looking at all my successes, another huge strategy that is extremely valuable is the inventory of success. And I talked about this in my book, Business in Blue Jeans. An inventory of success is a list of your successes, obviously, very clearly. It can take many forms. Mine used to be a Word document, but now it's a Google Doc, so I can update it from anywhere. And mine is a list of all the successes I can remember. So it goes back as far as I can remember and includes a pumpkin carving contest from grade school, like that I won. And so it's old things like that, but it's also successes that my clients have had as a result of working with me, kind words my clients have emailed to me thanking me for my work, my book deal, the world record, good ideas that I've had, good moments I've had with my husband, successful changes that I've made in my life. And all the different things that I consider successes. And it's really about what's a success to you. The reason that an inventory of success is a powerful weapon against imposter syndrome is because it's an evidence track, right? It's a trail of evidence that you have a track record of success and that your successes are actual real things. So especially if you go back to childhood and do all the things you can remember, you begin to show a pattern to yourself. So when you experience imposter syndrome, you go back to your inventory of success, you look at it and you go, whoa, I actually had all those successes. Now, I have a little story about Hillary Clinton. Okay, this is not about politics, okay? I hope we can all agree that Hillary Clinton is an accomplished woman. I hope we can all agree on that. Irrespective of what you feel about her politically, I think we can all agree she's an accomplished woman. Now, when this whole email scandal started and they released all of her emails online, I was quite curious about what those emails looked like. I think you can get a lot of insight into people when you read their emails. So I sat down one afternoon and I read Hillary Clinton's emails because I thought these are going to give me insight into her personality and what she might be like. I'm curious. And I was right. I really did learn quite a bit. But I learned something I did not anticipate learning. As I read through Hillary Clinton's email, I discovered that Hillary Clinton loves to print things out. But it's what she likes to print out that's important. So Hillary received a ton of emails thanking her and saying kind words about her and about her work. And those were the emails she wanted printed out. So she would forward them to an assistant and she would say, please print or print this. So I made up a story about Hillary Clinton, and I want to be very clear, I totally made this up in my head. My clients have all heard this story. So my story that I made up about Hillary Clinton is that somewhere there's a binder that is Hillary Clinton's inventory of success, and she has her assistant print out these nice emails and put them in the binder. And when she's having a rough day or she needs some encouragement or reinforcement, she calls the assistant and says, bring me the binder. And Then she flips through her inventory of success and the kind things people have said and reminds herself of who she actually is. Now, I totally made this up, but I also kind of feel like this could be a thing. So my point is that if Hillary Clinton could have an inventory of success, you could too. And it's a really great exercise. It's a great thing to do. There is a space in your workbook to create your own inventory of success, although I hope it will be filled and you will need more space. So I encourage you to use a Google Doc or Microsoft Word, some way that you can keep it as a living, breathing document and keep adding to it. And I really encourage you to do this because it's such a powerful weapon. We're not going to take time for this today because this is something where you should really sit down and think about this. And I actually emailed my family members and said, what are some of the successes that I had as a kid that you can remember? And draw on your resources to make this a very full and complete document. And again, make it a working, living, breathing document that you continuously add to. Now, I think it's incredibly beneficial to have a supportive team. That means your staff and your assistants, as well as a coach who can remind you when you're letting imposter syndrome get the better of you. I also think it's super helpful when your family is supportive. That includes siblings, a spouse or partner, people who can help keep you focused on truth, and friends are great for that as well. Writing exercises is very beneficial. I give an exercise to many of my clients to look back on your life and find the things that you said yes to. So what are the things you've said you could have said no to, but you took a risk and said yes? Because that's an active choice that was neither luck nor deception. It was actually a choice you made. That exercise is also in your workbook. Another exercise is to sit down and for 10 minutes, write down all the things you believe about yourself, no matter how crazy or horrible. You're never going to show anyone, okay? You're going to write down all the deep, dark truths that you believe about yourself as a fraud. And then for a few minutes, just look at that list. Now, there are two things that are important. One is, would you ever allow anyone to say that about a friend of yours? The second one is, are those things actually true, or do you have evidence that they're not true? Once you kind of spend some time looking at that, and you can look at that, kind of keep it nearby and look at it for a week, but then burn it, shred it, whatever. Don't ever show that to anyone. This is just for you. All of these exercises are really just for you. And these two are very important. So I really want to encourage you, block off a few minutes, take the time to do these exercises. They're extremely powerful. They require more time than we have in this webinar, and they require a lot of thought and introspection. So I'm just going to recommend that you do these later today, but please do them because this is the work. This is the work that will really help you. Sometimes being in action helps. Being in action shows that you're not a fraud because you're doing a thing. You're doing the thing. So being in action to get toward your goals helps you to feel less like a fraud. Practice taking credit for your work. Practice owning it. Now, I give my clients homework like this all the time. And I encourage you to do this not on an ongoing basis, but just try it for a week and see what happens. So it's these kinds of exercises are useful in a time frame. If I just say practice taking credit, then you'll completely forget to do this. But if I say this week practice taking credit and next week we'll talk about how that went, then as a coach it's really effective because we start to have that conversation the next week and it's like your little homework. And so I'm giving you homework as your de facto coach. So practice taking credit for your work for a week and see what happens. Another thing to practice, and we'll do this, you can do this the week after. It's easy to say release perfection. So instead of saying release perfection, I'm going to say try for a week to release the need to be perfect. Let some things be imperfect. That doesn't mean you let mistakes and things that are flat out wrong or that are going to hurt you or your client go out the door. What I want you to do is find places where it's okay to release perfection and see how that goes for a week. It's something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks at the webinar on delegation, so keep your eyes open for that. It's very easy for people to say, stop comparing yourselves to others, and it's very difficult to do, especially in this culture. So I like to say, do look around you. Look around at other people. Really look and ask yourselves, how many of these other people are just hiding their own insecurities and vulnerabilities? And how good are they at hiding it? The answer is they're all hiding their securities and insecurities and vulnerabilities. Every one of us does it. And so we have the impression that I'm the only one in the room who doesn't know what I'm doing and everyone else does. But in fact, most people feel that way at one time or another. Everyone hides their insecurities or vulnerabilities. It's important for us to have a facade of confidence. And so most people are really good at hiding, and everybody's scared in some way. There are also some really effective and promising therapeutic methodologies. They're a little bit too complex to get into, especially since we're running out of time. There are some things that can be done in a coaching environment. And so I encourage you to, of course, pursue coaching and or therapy as an option to really knocking this thing out. Now, those of you who are on this webinar who would enjoy doing a session with me, I'm happy to do that. We'll explore, we'll see what your life is like, and we'll see how we might apply what we've talked about today. And we'll see how it might apply to you specifically. So just email me at the email address on the screen, and we'll schedule a time to have a conversation. And please remember that this webinar series is going to continue. We have another one coming up on how to play a bigger game when you already play big. Look for that. And we also will have other webinars coming up on delegation, coping with post-recession PTSD, which is a feeling like you might never get the next client. We're going to have webinars on self-worth and transition and perfectionism and dealing with difficult people. And there are quite a few coming up. So make sure you visit susanbaroncini-moe.com/webinars for upcoming webinars and to register for those. So thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Please be sure to do these exercises, do the work. It really will help you to conquer this imposter syndrome and at the very least manage it more effectively, but hopefully conquer it so that it doesn't plague you the way it does now. So again, thank you for coming. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you next time.